You know that feeling when a new goal suddenly feels like the beginning of a different life. You decide you're finally going to get fit, learn a language, write that book, start the business, or wake up early every morning. You make a plan. You download the app. You buy the equipment. You watch videos, organize your schedule, maybe even tell someone about it. And for a little while, you feel unstoppable. This time will be different. Then a few days pass, maybe a week. The excitement becomes quieter. The plan that once felt inspiring starts feeling like another obligation. You miss one day, then another. Eventually, that exciting new goal sits somewhere in the background while your attention moves towards something else. And here's the strange part. You were never bad at starting. You started with energy. You started with confidence. You started before most people even took the first step. So why does the motivation disappear when finishing actually matters? Why can you become completely obsessed with something at the beginning, only to lose interest when the work becomes repetitive, difficult, or uncertain? Maybe the problem isn't that you lack discipline. Maybe something much more predictable is happening beneath the surface. There is a reason the beginning of a new goal can feel powerful. You are not carrying the weight of the work yet. You are carrying possibility. Imagine deciding to run a marathon. On the first day, you can picture yourself crossing the finish line, stronger, healthier, proud. You can imagine the person you might become. What you don't have to imagine as vividly are the dark mornings, sore muscles, missed runs, repetitive training, and weeks when progress seems invisible. That difference matters. A beginning gives you the emotional reward of a future without demanding the full price of getting there. You can plan the perfect routine, buy the notebook, download the program, rearrange your calendar, and feel productive before you've done anything uncomfortable. And because the outcome is still uncertain, your imagination has room to make it exciting. Possibility is alive. You haven't failed. You haven't gotten bored. You haven't discovered how difficult the goal actually is. Then reality arrives. The work becomes ordinary. The results become slower. The distance to your goal becomes visible. Suddenly, you're no longer imagining completion. You're experiencing the process. This is where people often make a mistake. They interpret fading excitement as evidence that they chose the wrong goal or that they aren't disciplined enough. But losing the intensity of a beginning doesn't necessarily mean you've lost your desire. It may simply mean novelty has disappeared. The brain loves anticipation because anticipation contains possibility. Completion contains certainty. The beginning lets you imagine who you could become. The middle asks you to repeatedly behave like that person when nobody is impressed. Progress is slow, and the excitement is gone. So if motivation isn't the problem, what is? Maybe you've learned to chase the feeling of beginning, instead of building the tolerance required for finishing. Day one feels different. You wake up early because you actually want to. You open the language app and feel strangely excited about learning 10 new words. You sit down to write and imagine the finished book. You start exercising and picture yourself months from now, stronger and more confident. Even studying can feel satisfying when you're convinced this new routine will finally change everything. Day 3 is still good. The excitement has softened, but the goal still feels manageable. By day 10, something has changed. The same workout feels repetitive. The same vocabulary exercises feel tedious. The business idea requires another email, another revision, another problem you didn't expect. Writing means staring at the same paragraph longer than you want to. Studying means reviewing information you thought you already understood. Nothing is necessarily wrong. That's the problem. The goal has simply become ordinary. And by day 30, you may barely recognize the person who was so enthusiastic at the beginning. The new notebook is sitting untouched. The running shoes are collecting dust. The online course remains half-finished. The business plan is still open in a folder you haven't visited in weeks. Notice what happened. The amount of effort required didn't suddenly become impossible. What disappeared was novelty. At the beginning, almost everything feels like progress because everything is new. Later, progress becomes quieter. You repeat the same actions without receiving the same emotional reward. The work hasn't necessarily become harder, it has become less interesting. And that distinction can quietly determine whether you finish. Because when something stops feeling exciting, you have to decide whether you were committed to the outcome or simply attached to the feeling of becoming someone who might achieve it. Most unfinished goals don't collapse in one dramatic moment. They fade, one ordinary day at a time. The hardest part of almost anything worthwhile is rarely the beginning or the end. It is the middle. The beginning gives you excitement. The end gives you satisfaction. But the middle gives you something far less rewarding: repetition, uncertainty, and very little evidence that your effort is paying off. This is where the messy middle begins. You've already spent enough time to lose the novelty, but not enough to see the result. The goal is no longer new, yet the finish line still feels far away. You're doing the work, but the emotional reward has become harder to find. And this creates a strange temptation. You start looking for another beginning. Maybe you abandon the workout plan and discover a new fitness method. You stop learning Spanish and suddenly become fascinated by Japanese. You leave the business idea behind and begin researching another one. You pause the book you're writing because a different idea feels much more exciting. The new project feels alive again. You get that familiar rush, a fresh possibility, a clean slate, a new identity waiting to be explored. There are no mistakes yet, no boring routines, no disappointing results, just potential. And without realizing it, you've found an escape from the uncomfortable middle. The pattern becomes almost predictable. You start. You feel excited. Difficulty appears. Boredom follows. You abandon the project. Then you find something new to start. And because the new beginning feels good, your brain learns something dangerous. When commitment becomes uncomfortable, starting over provides relief. That's why this pattern can continue for years while still feeling like you're constantly making progress. You're always moving, but you're not necessarily moving forward. The unfinished projects begin to pile up quietly. Each one becomes evidence that you couldn't follow through, which makes the next beginning feel even more important. Maybe this is why you keep telling yourself, this time will be different. But the new goal isn't necessarily different. You're simply meeting the same cycle from the beginning again. And once you can recognize that cycle, something changes. What used to feel like a mysterious loss of motivation starts looking less like a personal flaw and more like a predictable moment you have been trained to escape. Sometimes when you say, "I don't want to do this anymore," what you really mean is, "I don't want to feel this way anymore." That's an important difference. When a project becomes difficult, it can bring more than boredom. It can bring pressure. You start wondering whether you're good enough. You compare your progress with people who seem far ahead. You worry that all this effort might still lead nowhere. The longer you continue, the harder it becomes to hide from those questions. Quitting makes those feelings disappear, at least temporarily. The moment you decide to stop, the pressure lifts. You don't have to solve the problem today. You don't have to face another disappointing result. You can close the laptop, put the book away, skip the workout, and tell yourself you'll figure it out later. And for a moment, you feel better. That's where the trap becomes powerful. Your brain doesn't necessarily learn, "This project was wrong." It may learn, "Escaping the project made me feel better." So the next time resistance appears, quitting becomes emotionally familiar. Not because you're weak and not because you don't care, but because relief is immediate while the reward for continuing is delayed. You're choosing between two experiences. One is temporary discomfort, uncertainty, frustration, boredom, or the possibility of falling short. The other is immediate relief. And immediate relief is persuasive. So ask yourself something uncomfortable the next time you want to quit. What if quitting feels good precisely because your brain has learned to associate unfinished work with relief? That doesn't mean you should force yourself to finish everything. Some goals genuinely deserve to be abandoned. But before you leave, learn to recognize what you're actually escaping. Are you leaving because the goal no longer matters? Or because continuing requires you to tolerate a feeling you desperately want to avoid? That question can change everything. There is another layer to this pattern, and it is more uncomfortable because it has less to do with productivity and more to do with identity. Think about how good it can feel to say, "I'm going to write a book." You can imagine the finished pages, the people who might read them, the person you could become. You are someone with a book inside you. The same thing happens when you say you're going to get fit, start a company, learn an instrument, or build something meaningful. As long as the project remains unfinished, its potential remains untouched. You haven't failed. You haven't been judged. You haven't had to discover whether your best effort was good enough. That can make possibility comforting. An unfinished dream can remain perfect in your imagination. You can always tell yourself, "I could have done it if I had really committed." And that sentence protects your ideal version of yourself. But finishing changes the rules. Once the book is written, someone can criticize it. Once the business launches, the market can reject it. Once you share your work, people can decide they don't like it. Once you complete the goal, you no longer get to hide behind potential. The result exists. And suddenly, finishing can feel more vulnerable than starting. This is the paradox. Sometimes you're not afraid of failing. You're afraid of finding out what happens when you genuinely try and the result becomes real. So you keep the project alive without bringing it to life. You start again, you research more, you improve the plan, you wait for the right moment. And preparation feels productive because it keeps possibility intact. But eventually, potential can become an emotional hiding place. The goal is not to destroy that potential by forcing yourself into perfection. It is to become willing to let your work exist in the real world, where it can be imperfect and still valuable. Because the person who finishes is not the person who never feels fear. It is the person who stops using unfinished potential as protection from being seen. So how do you break the cycle? Not by finding a better motivational video, not by creating a more complicated productivity system, and not by waiting until you suddenly become the kind of person who always feels disciplined. You break it by changing what you do when the excitement disappears. First, make the finish line embarrassingly clear. Don't say, "I want to write a book." Decide what finished actually means. Maybe it's a complete first draft of 40,000 words. Don't say, "I want to get fit." Decide what you're actually trying to complete this week. A vague goal gives your brain endless opportunities to move the goalpost. Second, expect motivation to disappear. This is important because most people interpret the disappearance of motivation as a signal that something is wrong. It isn't. If you expect the excitement to fade, then when it happens, you're not surprised. You simply recognize the next phase of the process. Of course, this feels boring now. I'm in the middle. Third, make the daily requirement smaller than your ego wants it to be. If your plan requires 2 hours every day, you'll eventually have a day when 2 hours feels impossible. Then missing one day becomes missing 3, and suddenly the entire project feels abandoned. Instead, create a minimum you can complete even on a bad day. 10 minutes. 1 page. 1 paragraph. One said, "The goal isn't to make massive progress every day. The goal is to keep your relationship with finishing alive." Fourth, separate working from feeling inspired. You don't need to feel like writing to write. You don't need to feel motivated to exercise. You don't need to feel confident before making the next decision. The ability to continue without the right emotion is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Fifth, stop keeping 10 unfinished projects alive at once. Choose one primary thing that you are committed to finishing. Every new idea can be written down. It doesn't have to become your new obsession. Because every time you abandon the current project for a more exciting one, you teach yourself that novelty deserves your commitment more than completion does. And finally, finish the imperfect version before trying to make it excellent. Your first draft can be bad. Your first product can be clumsy. Your first workout routine can be simple. Your first version only needs to exist. Because improvement becomes much easier when there is something real to improve. The goal isn't to eliminate boredom. It isn't to eliminate resistance. It isn't even to become someone who never wants to quit. The goal is simpler. Become someone who can feel the urge to quit without automatically obeying it. Every time you do that, you're building something more valuable than motivation. You're building evidence that you can trust yourself to finish. Go back to the beginning. You had an idea. You felt excited. You made plans. You imagined what your life would look like once you finally achieved it. And then, somewhere in the middle, the excitement disappeared. Maybe you thought that meant you weren't disciplined enough. Maybe you told yourself you had lost motivation. Maybe you assumed you simply weren't the kind of person who could commit. But perhaps that's not the real story. Perhaps you've just spent years practicing the same pattern. You practice starting. You practice getting excited. You practice imagining possibilities. And when the work becomes repetitive, uncertain, or uncomfortable, you practice leaving. The good news is that this means the pattern can be changed. Because finishing is not a personality trait. It's a skill. And like every skill, it gets stronger through repetition. The next time you feel the urge to abandon something, you don't need to force yourself to finish the entire mountain. Just take the next step. Finish the paragraph. Complete the workout. Send the application. Publish the imperfect version. Close the loop. Because every time you finish something, you're giving yourself evidence. Evidence that you can keep going after the excitement disappears. Evidence that boredom doesn't control you. Evidence that discomfort doesn't automatically mean you should stop. And eventually, those small pieces of evidence begin changing how you see yourself. You stop being someone who is always about to start. You become someone who finishes. So don't make your next goal another massive promise about who you're going to become. Pick one thing you've already abandoned. Something small enough to finish. And finish the smallest, meaningful version of it. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just completely. Because starting proves you can get excited. Finishing proves you can trust yourself. And that may be the real goal. Not becoming someone who never starts over, but becoming someone who knows that when something matters, they can stay long enough to see it through.